The sun dipped low on the horizon, casting a warm, golden glow over the quiet suburban road. The trees lining the street swayed gently in the evening breeze, their leaves rustling like whispers. The neighborhood was peaceful, the kind of place where people waved to each other from their porches and children rode bikes until the streetlights flickered on. But tonight, the tranquility felt fragile, like a thin veneer over something darker. Evelyn Carter, a 34-year-old woman of color, drove her sleek black sedan home after a long day at work. She was a senior consultant at a prestigious firm, known for her sharp mind and impeccable professionalism. Her tailored blazer and pencil skirt reflected her success, but her tired eyes betrayed the weight of her responsibilities. The car stereo played a soft jazz tune, the kind that soothed her nerves after a demanding afternoon. The smooth saxophone notes filled the car, but they couldn't quite drown out the faint hum of unease that had settled in her chest. She glanced at the clock on the dashboard, 6:47 p.m. She was running late. Her brother, Mayor James Carter, had invited her to dinner at his place, and she hated keeping him waiting. James was her rock, the one person who had always believed in her, even when the world seemed determined to knock her down. She smiled faintly at the thought of him, his booming laugh, and the way he always managed to make her feel like she could conquer anything. As she turned onto a less traveled street, the hum of unease grew louder. The road was empty, the houses spaced farther apart, their windows glowing faintly with the warm light of evening. It was the kind of street where nothing ever happened, until it did. That's when she noticed the flashing lights of a police cruiser in her rearview mirror. Her stomach tightened. She hadn't been speeding, had she? She glanced at the speedometer, 28 miles per hour in a 25 miles per hour zone. Surely that wasn't enough to warrant a stop. She pulled over to the side of the road, her hands gripping the steering wheel a little tighter than necessary. The cruiser parked behind her, its lights still flashing, casting alternating red and blue shadows across the interior of her car. She took a deep breath, reminding herself to stay calm. This was just a routine stop. It had to be. She had been through this before, too many times to count. The polite questions, the suspicious glances, the subtle, and sometimes not so subtle reminders that she didn't belong in this neighborhood, in this car, in this life. But she had learned to navigate it, to keep her composure, to smile even when every fiber of her being wanted to scream. The officer stepped out of the cruiser, his silhouette framed by the setting sun. He was a white man in his early 40s, his uniform crisp and his expression unreadable. His badge gleamed under the fading sunlight. Officer Dan Harris. Evelyn rolled down her window, her voice steady but cautious. "Good evening, officer. Is there a problem?" Harris leaned in, his tone clipped and condescending. "License and registration." "Ma'am." Evelyn frowned, her unease growing. "May I ask why I was pulled over?" Harris's eyes narrowed, his lips curling into a faint smirk. "I'm the one asking questions here, not you. Now, hand over your documents." Evelyn reached into her glove compartment, her fingers trembling slightly as she retrieved her license and registration. The leather interior of the compartment felt cool against her skin, a small comfort in the growing tension. She handed the documents to Harris, her gaze steady despite the knot forming in her stomach. Her heart pounded in her chest, but she refused to let it show. She had been here before, too many times, and she knew how this game was played. Stay calm, stay polite, don't give them a reason. Harris took the documents, his eyes narrowing as he examined them with exaggerated scrutiny. He held her license up to the fading sunlight, tilting it this way and that, as if searching for some hidden flaw. His smirk widened, a cruel twist of his lips that made Evelyn's skin crawl. "Nice car for someone like you," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "You sure you didn't borrow it?" Evelyn's jaw tightened, but she kept her composure. She forced herself to breathe evenly, to keep her voice calm and measured. "It's my car, officer. I have the paperwork to prove it." Harris chuckled, a low, mocking sound that sent a shiver down her spine. He leaned closer, his breath hot against her face. "You know, I've seen your type before. Driving cars you can't afford, living in neighborhoods you don't belong in, always thinking you're above the law." Evelyn's hands clenched into fists in her lap, her nails digging into her palms. She wanted to scream, to tell him exactly what she thought of him and his assumptions. But she knew better. She had learned the hard way that losing her temper would only make things worse. So she stayed silent, her gaze locked on his, refusing to look away. Harris's smirk faltered for a moment, as if her calm defiance unnerved him. But then he straightened, his expression hardening. Without warning, he tore her license in half right in front of her, the sound of ripping paper sharp and final. "Oops," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "Looks like you won't be driving this fancy ride anymore." Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. She stared at the torn pieces of her license, her mind racing. This wasn't just a power play. It was a deliberate act of humiliation, a reminder that no matter how successful she was, no matter how hard she worked, some people would always see her as less than. Her hands trembled as she reached for her phone, her fingers fumbling slightly as she unlocked it. She opened the camera app and began recording, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions raging inside her. "Officer Harris," she said, her tone calm but firm. "You just destroyed my license without cause. I'd like an explanation." Harris laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Go ahead. Record me. See who they'll believe, a cop or some woman without a license." Evelyn's jaw tightened, but she didn't respond. She kept the camera trained on him, her hands steady despite the anger simmering beneath the surface. She knew this wasn't just about her. It was about every person who had ever been treated unfairly, every person who had ever been made to feel small because of who they were. She wasn't going to let him win. Harris noticed her movement and sneered, his lips curling into a cruel smile. His eyes flicked to the phone in her hand, the red recording light blinking like a tiny beacon of defiance. He leaned back slightly, crossing his arms over his chest, his posture radiating arrogance. "Go ahead. Record me," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. "See who they'll believe, a cop or some woman without a license." Evelyn's grip on the phone tightened, her knuckles whitening as she held it up, the camera trained squarely on his face. Her voice was steady, but there was a fire in her eyes that hadn't been there before. "Officer Harris," she said, her tone calm but firm. "You just destroyed my license without cause. I'd like an explanation." Harris laughed, a harsh, grating sound that echoed in the quiet street. He shook his head, his smirk widening as if he found the whole situation amusing. "You're wasting your time, sweetheart," he said, his voice laced with mockery. "No one's going to care about your little video. You think anyone's going to take your word over mine? Please." Evelyn's jaw tightened, but she didn't lower the phone. She kept her gaze locked on his, refusing to look away. "This isn't about my word against yours," she said, her voice rising slightly. "This is about accountability. You can't just destroy someone's property and expect to get away with it." Harris's smirk faltered for a moment, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by the same cold, dismissive expression. "Accountability," he repeated, his tone mocking. "You think you're in a position to lecture me about accountability? You're the one driving around without a valid license." Evelyn's heart pounded in her chest, but she forced herself to stay calm. She knew he was trying to provoke her, to make her lose her temper so he could justify his actions. But she wasn't going to give him the satisfaction. "I had a valid license," she said, her voice steady. "You're the one who destroyed it, and I have proof." She gestured to the phone, the red light still blinking. Harris glanced at it again, his smirk fading slightly. For a moment, there was silence, the tension between them thick enough to cut with a knife. Then he took a step closer, his voice dropping to a low, menacing tone. "You think that little thing is going to save you," he said, his eyes narrowing. "You're in over your head. Sweetheart, you don't know who you're messing with." Evelyn didn't flinch. She held the phone steady, her gaze never wavering. "I know exactly who I'm dealing with," she said, her voice calm but firm. "And I'm not afraid of you." Harris stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he laughed again, but this time it sounded forced, almost nervous. "We'll see about that," he said, his voice tight. He turned and walked back to his cruiser. his steps quick and deliberate, as if he couldn't get away fast enough. Evelyn watched him go, her heart still racing, but a small sense of triumph bubbling up inside her. She knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot, but for the first time since this nightmare began. She felt like she had the upper hand, and she wasn't going to let it go. Evelyn took a deep breath, her chest rising and falling as she steadied herself. The air felt heavy, charged with the tension of the moment. She could feel the weight of Harris's gaze on her, his arrogance radiating like a physical force. But she refused to let him intimidate her. She straightened her shoulders, her voice calm but firm as she spoke. "You might want to rethink that attitude. Officer, do you know who I am?" Harris rolled his eyes, his smirk twisting into a sneer. He leaned back slightly, his arms crossed over his chest, his posture radiating disdain. "Oh, let me guess," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "You're the Queen of England?" Evelyn's lips curved into a faint smile, but there was no warmth in it, only a quiet, steely resolve. She held his gaze, her eyes unwavering. "No," she said, her voice steady. "I'm Evelyn Carter. My brother is Mayor James Carter." For a moment, there was silence. The words hung in the air like a thunderclap, their impact reverberating through the quiet street. Harris froze, his smirk faltering as the color drained from his face. His eyes widened slightly, and for the first time since the encounter began, he looked uncertain. "You're lying," he said, his voice tight, but there was a flicker of doubt in his tone. Evelyn didn't respond immediately. She let the silence stretch, let the weight of her words sink in. She could see the gears turning in his mind, the realization dawning on him that he might have made a very big mistake. Finally, she spoke, her voice calm but firm. "I'm not lying," she said, "and if you don't believe me, you can call him yourself." She reached into her purse and pulled out her phone, her movements deliberate and unhurried. She unlocked it and dialed a number, her fingers steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. The phone rang once, twice, and then a familiar voice answered. "Evelyn, is everything okay?" She held the phone out to Harris, her gaze never leaving his. "Here," she said. "Talk to him yourself." Harris hesitated, his bravado crumbling under the weight of the situation. He stared at the phone as if it were a live grenade, his hand trembling slightly as he reached for it. He took it from her, his voice uncharacteristically shaky as he spoke. "This is Officer Dan Harris. Who am I speaking to?" The voice on the other end was calm but authoritative, the kind of voice that commanded respect. "This is Mayor James Carter. Who am I speaking to?" Harris swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. "This is Officer Dan Harris," he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "I, pulled over a woman who claims to be your sister." There was a pause, and then Mayor Carter's tone turned icy. "Stay right there. Officer, I'm on my way." Harris handed the phone back to Evelyn, his face pale and his hands trembling. He opened his mouth to say something, but no words came out. For the first time since the encounter began, he looked genuinely afraid. Evelyn took the phone, her expression calm but resolute. She didn't say anything, didn't gloat or smirk. She simply stood there, her gaze steady and her posture tall, as if to remind him that she wasn't someone he could push around. The tables had turned, and she wasn't going to let him forget it. Evelyn didn't respond. Instead, she held Harris's gaze for a moment longer, her expression calm but unyielding. She could see the flicker of doubt in his eyes, the way his bravado wavered ever so slightly. Without breaking eye contact, she reached into her purse and pulled out her phone. Her fingers moved swiftly, dialing a number she knew by heart. The phone rang once, twice, and then a familiar voice answered. "Evelyn, is everything okay?" She didn't answer her brother directly. Instead, she held the phone out to Harris, her voice steady but firm. "Here," she said. "Talk to him yourself." Harris hesitated, his hand hovering in the air as if he were afraid to touch the phone. His earlier arrogance had evaporated, replaced by a growing sense of unease. He glanced at Evelyn, then at the phone, his mind racing. For a moment, it seemed like he might refuse, might try to bluff his way out of the situation. But then, With a shaky hand, he took the phone from her. "This is Officer Dan Harris," he said, his voice uncharacteristically shaky. "Who am I speaking to?" The voice on the other end was calm but authoritative, the kind of voice that commanded respect. "This is Mayor James Carter. Who am I speaking to?" Harris swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. He glanced at Evelyn, then back at the phone, his confidence crumbling with every passing second. "This is Officer Dan Harris," he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "I pulled over a woman who claims to be your sister." There was a pause, and then Mayor Carter's tone turned icy. "Stay right there. Officer, I'm on my way." Harris handed the phone back to Evelyn, his face pale and his hands trembling. He opened his mouth to say something, but no words came out. For the first time since the encounter began, he looked genuinely afraid. The sound of tires crunching on gravel broke the tense silence. A black SUV pulled up, its sleek, polished exterior gleaming under the streetlights. It was followed by two more police cars, their lights flashing but their sirens silent. The doors of the SUV swung open, and Mayor James Carter stepped out, his presence commanding immediate attention. He was a tall, imposing figure, his sharp suit and confident stride exuding authority. His expression was calm, but there was a fire in his eyes that hinted at the storm brewing beneath the surface. He walked straight to Evelyn, his concern evident as he took in the scene. His sister stood tall, her posture unyielding, but he could see the faint tremor in her hands and the tightness in her jaw. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice low but filled with warmth. Evelyn nodded, her voice calm but firm. "I'm fine, James, but this officer destroyed my license and threatened to impound my car." Mayor Carter's jaw tightened, his gaze shifting to Officer Dan Harris, who stood a few feet away, his earlier bravado replaced by a pale, nervous expression. The mayor's eyes blazed with a mixture of anger and disappointment as he stepped toward Harris. "Explain yourself, officer," he said, his voice cold and clipped. Harris stammered, his confidence crumbling under the weight of the mayor's presence. I thought she was driving a stolen vehicle." "Sir," he said, his voice shaky, "I was just doing my job." Mayor Carter's eyes narrowed, his tone sharp as a blade. "Your job? Your job is to protect and serve, not harass and intimidate. Do you have any evidence to support your actions?" Harris looked down, unable to meet the mayor's gaze. His hands fidgeted at his sides, and his voice was barely above a whisper. "No, sir." The silence that followed was deafening. The other officers who had arrived with the mayor stood a few paces back, their expressions a mix of shock and unease. Even the air seemed to grow heavier, charged with the tension of the moment. Mayor Carter took a step closer to Harris, his voice low but filled with authority. "Let me make something very clear," he said, his words measured but laced with intensity. "This kind of behavior is unacceptable. It's a betrayal of the trust this community places in its officers, and it will not be tolerated." Harris opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. His face was pale, his earlier arrogance replaced by a look of sheer panic. He glanced at Evelyn, then back at the mayor, his mind racing for a way to salvage the situation. But there was no salvaging this. The damage was done. Mayor Carter turned to the other officers, his voice firm and commanding. "Take Officer Harris into custody. He's suspended effective immediately, pending a full investigation." The officers hesitated for a moment, glancing at each other uncertainly. But then one of them stepped forward, his expression resolute. "Yes, sir," he said, moving to handcuff Harris. As Harris was led away, his head hung low. Mayor Carter turned back to Evelyn, his expression softened, the fire in his eyes replaced by a look of deep concern. "I'm sorry you had to go through this," he said, his voice gentle, "but I promise you, this will not be swept under the rug." Evelyn nodded, her shoulders relaxing slightly. "Thank you, James," she said, her voice steady but tinged with relief. "I just hope this leads to real change." Mayor Carter placed a hand on her shoulder, his grip firm but comforting. "It will," he said, his tone resolute. "This is just the beginning." The next day, The City Hall auditorium was packed with reporters, photographers, and concerned citizens. The air buzzed with anticipation, the room filled with the murmur of voices and the occasional flash of a camera. At the front of the room, a podium stood flanked by the city's seal. The words unity, justice, progress emblazoned beneath it. The atmosphere was tense, the weight of the previous night's events hanging heavy in the air. Mayor James Carter stepped up to the podium, his presence commanding immediate attention. He was dressed in a sharp navy suit, his tie perfectly knotted, but his expression was anything but polished. His face was serious, his jaw set, and his eyes burned with a quiet intensity. He adjusted the microphone, the sound echoing through the room, and the crowd fell silent. "Good morning," he began, his voice strong and resolute. "Thank you all for being here today. I want to address an incident that occurred last night, an incident that has shaken not only my family but our entire community." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the room. Every eye was on him, every ear tuned to his words. "Last night, my sister, Evelyn Carter, was subjected to an unjust and humiliating encounter with one of our officers. This behavior is unacceptable and will not be tolerated in our city." The room erupted in murmurs, the sound of pens scratching against notepads and cameras clicking filling the air. Mayor Carter waited for the noise to subside before continuing, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "Evelyn is a respected member of this community. She is a hardworking professional, a loving sister, and a proud citizen of this city. What happened to her last night was not just an attack on her dignity, it was an attack on the values we hold dear as a community." He paused again, letting his words sink in. The room was silent now, the weight of his message settling over everyone present. "Effective immediately," he continued, his tone firm, "I am launching a full investigation into the conduct of our police force. This investigation will be thorough, transparent, and impartial. Any officer found guilty of misconduct will face severe consequences." The murmurs returned, louder this time, but Mayor Carter raised his hand, silencing the room once more. "This is not just about one incident," he said, his voice rising with conviction. "This is about accountability. It's about ensuring that every member of our community, regardless of their race, gender, or background, is treated with the respect and dignity they deserve. It's about rebuilding the trust between our police force and the people they are sworn to protect." He leaned forward, his hands gripping the edges of the podium. "To the members of our police force who uphold their oath with integrity and honor, I want to say this: you have my full support. But to those who abuse their power, who betray the trust of the people they serve, know this: there will be no place for you in this city. Not on my watch." The room erupted into applause, the sound thunderous and sustained. Mayor Carter stepped back from the podium, his expression resolute but his eyes reflecting the weight of the moment. He nodded to the crowd, a silent acknowledgement of their support, and then turned and walked off the stage. As he exited the room, the reporters began shouting questions, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of urgency. But Mayor Carter didn't stop. He had said what needed to be said, and now it was time to act. Years later, Evelyn stood at the podium in a packed community center, the same one where she had first shared her story after the incident with Officer Harris. The room was filled with activists, community leaders, and young people who had been inspired by her journey. The walls were adorned with posters from past rallies and photographs of moments that had defined the movement for equality in the city. Evelyn adjusted the microphone, her eyes scanning the crowd. She saw familiar faces, friends, allies, and even a few former skeptics who had since become staunch supporters. "The fight for equality never ends," she began, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "But as long as we keep pushing forward, we'll keep making progress." The room erupted into applause, but Evelyn held up a hand, signaling for silence. She wasn't done. "I stand here today not just as Evelyn Carter, but as someone who has seen firsthand the power of resilience and the importance of standing up for what's right. What happened to me that day on the side of the road wasn't just an isolated incident. It was a symptom of a much larger problem, one that still exists in our society." She paused, her gaze settling on a young woman in the front row. It was Amara, the activist Evelyn had mentored over the years. Amara had grown from a passionate but uncertain young woman into a fearless leader, organizing protests, leading workshops, and even running for local office. Evelyn smiled at her, a silent acknowledgement of the torch she was passing on. But look at how far we've come. Evelyn continued. When I first shared my story, many people didn't believe me. They said I was exaggerating, that I was playing the race card. But we didn't back down. We fought for accountability, for transparency, and for change. And because of that, our city has become a model for others. We've implemented new training programs for law enforcement, established community oversight boards, and created platforms for marginalized voices to be heard. The crowd cheered again, but Evelyn's expression grew serious. But let me be clear, this is not the end. It's just the beginning. There are still people in this city, in this country, who face discrimination every single day. There are still systems in place that perpetuate inequality, and there are still those who would rather silence us than listen to our truths. She glanced at a photograph on the wall, a black and white image of herself standing beside her brother, Mayor James Carter, at the press conference that had changed everything. James had since retired from politics, but his legacy lived on in the policies he had championed and the doors he had opened for others. My brother once told me that change starts with one voice, Evelyn said, her voice softening. But it doesn't end there. It takes all of us, every single person in this room, to keep that change alive. It takes courage. It takes persistence. And it takes love. Love for ourselves, love for each other, and love for the world we want to build. The room was silent now, every eye fixed on Evelyn. She took a deep breath, her next words carrying the weight of years of struggle and triumph. So I ask you, what will your voice do? How will you use it to lift others up? How will you ensure that no one else has to go through what I did? Amara stood up, her eyes glistening with tears. We'll keep fighting, she said, her voice strong and clear. For you, for everyone who came before us, and for everyone who will come after. Evelyn nodded, a proud smile spreading across her face. That's all I ask. Keep fighting, keep pushing, and never, ever give up. As she stepped away from the podium, the crowd rose to their feet, their applause thunderous and unwavering. Evelyn made her way through the room, shaking hands and exchanging hugs, her heart full but her mind already racing toward the next battle. She knew the work wasn't over. It never would be. But as long as there were people like Amara, people who refused to stay silent, she had hope. Outside, the sun was setting, casting the same golden glow over the city that it had on the day of the incident. Evelyn paused for a moment, taking it all in. The streets were quieter now, the air filled with the sounds of laughter and conversation instead of tension and fear. She climbed into her car, the same sleek black sedan she had driven all those years ago, and started the engine. The jazz tune that played was the same one she had listened to that fateful afternoon. But this time, it felt different. It felt like a reminder of how far she had come, and how far she still had to go. As she drove home, Evelyn thought about the future. She thought about Amara and the countless others who would carry the torch forward. She thought about her brother, who had taught her the power of standing up for what's right. And she thought about herself, not as a victim, but as a warrior who had turned pain into purpose, fear into fuel, and silence into a symphony of change. The fight for equality never ends, but neither does the hope. And as long as there was hope, Evelyn knew they would keep moving forward, together,